Good morning and good afternoon wherever you're at. Thank you so much for joining us on a beautiful Tuesday. My name is Cassie Whitlock. I'm the director here at BambooHR, and we are really excited today to be partnering with Lattice on this webinar, Employee Engagement Strategy, Getting to the Root of Your Employee Experience. And registrants, you can submit questions using the chat feature on the interface. We'll be doing a Q&A session at the end of the webinar, and we'll try to address as many questions as we have time for. And we will be sending out a copy of the slide deck and a recording of the webinar within just a couple of days. So please be watching your inbox for that. I know everybody's always excited to get that recording. And we have a couple of great offers for all of our attendees, and we'll cover those right at the end before our Q&A session. This webinar does qualify for SHRM credit, and you will receive that information automatically at the end of the presentation. And I believe that's kind of all of our housekeeping items. So let me go ahead and get started by introducing Jack Altman. Jack Altman is the founder and CEO of Lattice, a modern performance management platform for growing companies. And their company is based in San Francisco and serves over 600 customers around the world. Prior to starting Lattice, Jack was the VP of Business and Corporate Development at Teespring and a venture investor in companies such as Opendoor, Instacart, Pinterest, Gusto, LendUp, Soylent, and Patreon. Jack grew up in St. Louis and studied economics at Princeton. And again, my name is Cassie Whitlock. I'm the Director of HR here at BambooHR. And as one of our attendees reached out to me on LinkedIn this week and said, I'm also a reformed finance person who's passionate about HR. So hopefully you're out there today, but shout out to you. Love to have y'all connect on LinkedIn if you're interested. I love the world of HR. I love the intersection of business and people and helping find success there in growing businesses and achieving both individual, team, and company goals. So with that, we are going to get started and jump right into employee engagement. Jack, do you want to start us off?
Absolutely. And Cassie, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And Cassie, I am a reformed finance person too, and I'm so much happier to be in the world of HR now. And I'm really happy to be talking about employee engagement today. And I thought before we started, just talking about what employee engagement is so that we all know what we mean. From a definitional perspective, people tend to use employee engagement to mean the emotional engagement an employee has with the organization and the engagement that they have with its goals. The reason this is important is because that emotional commitment means that engaged employees actually care about their work more, they care about their company more. And in practice, when you see the difference between an engaged employee and an unengaged employee, it's so obvious to everyone around them, to their team, that it doesn't feel like you have to push to make them do great. They do it themselves, and they're happier, they're more fulfilled. That's what you want to get to. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. And to get started, we wanted to talk about a concept of bottoms-up employee engagement. And Cassie later is also going to be talking about top-down employee engagement in contrast. But bottom-up employee engagement is what we want. And when we talk about this, what we're really talking about is starting with the employee. So instead of starting with the company, we start with the employee. And so the way to do that, and we'll be talking about this a lot throughout the webinar, but it all comes back to listening and then valuing the feedback. That is what it's all about. That is the sort of key vehicle that you have to show that you care, to implement change. And study after study shows that doing employee engagement from the employee and working from there, as opposed to sort of top-down where you start from organizational initiatives, is going to be much more effective to drive engagement. A couple quick stats about why you should care. The first sort of staggering statistic is that only 1/3 of employees in the U.S. are engaged in their jobs. The obvious flip side of that is that 2/3 are disengaged. And so engagement means people like their jobs. It means they're happy. It means they are excited to come to work every day. And so the thought that 2/3 of the employees in America don't feel that way and aren't working towards both business and personal goals that are overlapping and aligned, that are, feeling like they have a manager that supports them, and all of these other things that go along with employee engagement, just from a human level, should be sort of the first striking statistic. The second thing to think about with employee engagement is that it's extremely valuable. So according to Gallup, when business units are engaged, they have 21% more profitability and almost 50% decreased turnover. Turnover is extraordinarily expensive. So when good employees that you want to be staying with you are leaving, you have the costs associated with hiring, with recruiting, with onboarding, with roles being unfilled. And then those employees, when they're at their jobs, are much more effective when they're engaged. And so how does this sort of sum up? According to Gallup, the total number is over $600 billion as a cost to U.S. total productivity. So, those numbers, no matter sort of the exact accuracy, are staggering. And so we know that there's sort of this personal cost. We know that it's expensive. Any of us who have been in an organization where a workforce is highly engaged or highly disengaged feels that difference. But you look at some of these numbers, you see what the actual impact is on the workforce, and it's very easy to start caring about the problem. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Cassie to talk a little bit about the different types of employee engagement that you can practice.
Yeah, and that's a big dollar amount. And a lot of times HR professionals will say, how do I get buy-in from my executive team? That's buy-in to me. Talk about the cost to the organization and the opportunity to win there. All right, so let's look at the opportunity from both directions, top-down versus bottom-up. We know that engagement is important, and so how do you increase engagement? And you can look at both sides of the theory about what's different between these two strategies. Your top-down strategies rely on organization-wide efforts developed in the leadership suite, usually facilitated by HR. And your bottom-up strategies are going to measure engagement on every level, and it's going to really focus on incorporating feedback from your employees. You may have seen the top-down process play out in that your organization recognizes an engagement problem. So HR asks for a budget to implement a program, something maybe like Employee of the Month, or maybe you want a new office perk within your location. But these solutions don't always align with the causes of the actual employee disengagement, and therefore the problem is going to persist. For example, if employees are really finding it hard to focus on work because they're wondering how they're going to pay their mortgage based on their paycheck, that $20 gift card to the candle store that was meant to show appreciation, sometimes it's almost going to feel like a mockery. It's actually going to hurt and point out the pain to them more visibly. Or if employees feel like the work they do is invisible because no one nominates them for the Employee of the Month, or because the award always goes to the employee in the customer support team who gets the most votes, and by the way, they're the largest department, right? We all know how that works. Or what if employees return from a heartfelt presentation on values to have their manager really crack the whip on getting back to work, and it feels like they're in this kind of soulless grind? Lasting employee engagement isn't brought or ordered. Lasting engagement grows from the bottom up through those consistent actions that make your organization's real culture. And to shape engagement in your organization, you need to not just start at the bottom and grow your way to the top, but I really like to connect the two. I think having both options is very important to a well-rounded experience and to drive better outcomes. But I think when you really want success, you have to view both through that lens of the bottom-up perspective. So let's consider sequoia trees. It's the largest single-stem tree in the world, with its trunk shooting up hundreds of feet into the air. The tallest sequoia is actually taller than the Empire State Building, so that's getting up there. Their root systems are actually shallow in comparison to their height. but they've got a super secret. These shallow roots grow connections with the root system of the other trees in the forest. So they're able to draw strength from each other for both individual and then, of course, the group success. When we're looking at bottom-up engagement, it's going to act in the same way. Understanding ideas and facilitating feedback throughout your organization is going to help grow connections between your people, letting you make sure that everyone's on board with your organization's mission, your visions, and your values. So BambooHR has 2 values that sum up an effective way to look at employee engagement. We have 7 values in total, but today I only want to share 2 of them. So the first is grow from good to great. And this perspective, excuse me, makes it clear that our goal for our employees isn't to have them just show up to do the same thing that they did yesterday and then go home, but instead our organization is working to look at the full employee journey instead of just making sure that people are in seats. It's a bigger difference that we're looking to make. And so when employees can see how their life's concerns, not just in the workplace, but their personal growth and their relationships, when they can see that everything kind of aligns together within their work experience, then they have an intrinsic motivation to better both themselves and to better the organization. And the other value that we can pair with this is lead from where you are. So when employees have the conditions where they can take accountability for their work, where the organization communicates the high expectations and provides the right levels of authority and resources so that you can actually do it, it's empowering to employees, and it helps them to connect both to each other and to the organization. It helps remove that idea that great ideas are reserved for top levels or only for managers. Instead, it's saying that a recent college graduate can contribute on just as meaningful a level as somebody from the C-suite can. And so like a root system, these deep connections in ideas and shared values aren't always apparent at first glance, but they're the first step to growing the results of engagement in your organization. And honestly, without them, your engagement programs will be a lot like you, the HR person, trying to grow a forest by wrapping a rope around a tree and pulling as hard as you can to get those trees to grow.
And Cassie, that's a great point. And just to jump in there from the way we think about this at Lattice, it's not HR's job to ensure directly that every single employee is happy and engaged. It's instead their job to partner with managers and with teams to together build sort of an effective set of strategies to resolve issues, to drive engagement. And so HR can bring a bird's eye view to the company and sort of bring a unified sense of engagement and values like what you just described. And then the managers are the ones who can work with their teams directly to sort of operate on the ground towards that common goal. So that partnership is really critical.
Perfect. And the other aspect of that, it means, our beloved HR people, you're not alone in this. Please partner with your leadership teams, your managers, your C-suite. Make sure that you're working together in a unison. Let's talk about that alignment factor again. So today we're going to look at how bottom-up engagement practices work well with the top-level strategy so that we can really maximize that empowering of employees and deliver the end results that we want to see within our organization. So the first thing we're going to do is look at that alignment factor that I was just mentioning. It's critical to achieving the outcomes for employee engagement. How employees meet your company's needs, the organizational goals, is just as important as how the organization meets each individual employee's need. If there's going to be a mismatch, then the relationship will not work out long term, whether the employer lets the employee go or even if the employee leaves in search of a more fulfilling work. And there's no single point in your employee's experience that will permanently engage them with your organization. You know, I sometimes as an adult, I think, why do we have to continue to have a recognition of my birthday every year? I'm past an age where I care to recognize it any longer. But the reality is it's important and it matters to be able to look back at life's achievements and stay focused going forward. That's how I reflect on birthdays. But the same thing is true here for your employees. It's not a checkbox. You can't just do it once and then you can move on. It's about creating a consistent pattern and cadence in your organization that is sustainable by everyone within the organization, not just you independently, again, as HR. And so when you're going to check for alignment, I want you to think about two things. Number one, are both parties growing? And then number two, if they're growing, are they doing so in the same direction? When both of these statements are true, that is when you are going to be in alignment with your employees and vice versa. Here's the thing. You can't check the direction of that relationship with a single point. But that's often what we end up doing kind of during the hiring process. It's a great example. Hopefully you don't hire new employees without a reason. Often there's a real pain, there's a need for your organization that you're looking to solve, and you're either replacing an employee that left or maybe expanding the capacity of a department or team to match increased scope, or whatever's new in your organization. You need to hire somebody. So hiring managers want to solve these problems as quickly as they possibly can. I understand that when I'm in hiring manager mode, it's painful because I still have my day job. But you still need to do it well. And so as you're dealing with that pain, you want to make sure you do it the right way. And it can be tempting sometimes to speed up the process. Just hire the first person that meets the standard qualifications, or maybe whose characteristics seem to match on a surface level. It's important that you want to spend the time to really assess the whole candidate so that you can see how they might grow over time within your organization. A lot of times our hiring managers try to solve this pain point by just creating duplicates, right? I can say, I love working with Shelley. If I can just find another Shelley, I win. And then just look for things that remind me of Shelley, but that's not really going to be a good end goal. The thinking goes that if the applicant's resume matches close enough, or maybe their personality, or sometimes even what they look like, then that candidate will follow the same path as the ideal worker that you're trying to replicate. And sometimes this process is going to extend to focus on some surface level characteristics that aren't even related to the job at all. Sometimes we like to excuse these things and say I'm screening for fit, or I've heard I'm screening for culture. And these can be innocuous. It can be, hey, do you like Lord of the Rings or not? But sometimes it can also put us in territory that isn't appropriate, where perhaps there's discrimination or bias going on in the hiring process. Glassdoor publishes an infamous list of worst questions, and I love that the companies kind of self-report, or maybe it's the interviewees that are sharing the questions that were asked in the interview process, and I'll withhold company names to protect the guilty. But some of the ones that made me smile, these are questions that are probably not going to be great at helping you really find culture fit for your company, but in our rush to do it, it seems like it'll work, so we try it. One of the questions, what's the funniest thing that's ever happened to you recently? You'll probably get a clever story, or perhaps they're boring, or perhaps there's going to be TMI going on in that story, and you've just gone into an area that you never want to get into in hiring. Or another one, are you more of a hunter or a gatherer? Again, how does that relate to the job, and how do I know that that answer helps me understand their ability to connect with peers and coworkers and be a better, healthier part of the team? Or sometimes we copycat in recruiting, but it's unintentional. A study of 53,000 professionals from PayScale explored employee referrals and employee referral programs. And there were some very interesting stats there. They actually found that white females were 12% less likely to receive a referral, that men of color were 26% less likely, and women of color were 35% less likely. And if a large percentage of your hires come from referral programs, then this copycat effect can start to actually be compounded. In research, Women in Silicon Valley, if you want to learn more about the large effect that this can have, please go out and look at that. Make sure you're aware of what you're doing in your referral programs. So we could give a whole presentation on the short-sighted recruiting techniques. And I know our head of talent acquisition, J.D. Conway, he recently gave a webinar on that. But the thing is that there are flawed recruiting practices, and they all have the same thing in common. They involve reacting to the personal needs for a quick fit instead of deliberately hiring candidates who have diverse characteristics to add to your culture. So diversity in background, diversity in previous experience, and diversity in skill. So hiring culture fits may leave your organization with less diversity, higher turnover, and greater recruiting costs as recruiters struggle to find that exact duplicate, increased time to hire. And when these new hires realize that the role doesn't align with their long-term goals, then they're going to leave your organization, and you're left with starting that recruiting process all over again. So how do you solve this problem? And there's only so much that you can glean from a resume. Luckily, your organization isn't the only ones thinking of these alignment issues. Your candidates, those who are wanting to join your organization, are also looking at that alignment. And so providing information to them in the hiring process is going to lead to better engagement. Whether you're attracting new candidates or onboarding new hires or reboarding current employees who have disengaged from your organization, the first step to building this engagement is to go ahead and define what you want your employees to engage with. You need to define your ideal culture through practical application of your company values. And this begins with an introduction of your values on your website. You want to make sure it's out there and available. A demonstration of the values in action when candidates are interacting in your workplace, I think, is one of the most important factors. So at BambooHR, if you're in the application process and you're coming in for an interview, you get to go around the building and meet different departments and get a sense for what it's like to work here, to see the team that you might be joining, and to start to build those connections. But they also get to see our values in action, and it always makes me smile when I hear feedback from a candidate who expresses that they heard somebody talking about one of our values to them. And they're always impressed that not only do people know our values, but they speak to them and then hold each other accountable to act on them. When you're looking at what are some of the early things, the early stage things you can do, signing forms is a really basic part of onboarding. Probably all of our least favorite, right? I think I can speak for all of us in that regard. And this process can and should start as soon as a new hire accepts the offer. Are you using technology? Are you using e-signatures so that first day can focus on actually making connections with people and the roles in the organization instead of just doing paperwork? Are you looking at that great first day? When you think about making great first impressions, day one for a new hire is super important. On our team, we make sure that we go out to lunch together and get to know each other just as people and start to build connections on a human level. And then, of course, at work, we're learning the job. What about ongoing support and information resources? Now, this doesn't mean that you ditch paperwork and training, but as you focus on the new employee experience over the first, let's say, 90 days of a new hire, there are several ways to make sure that they're internalizing your culture, the training for the position, and how to understand and use the benefits that they're going to be getting. So one example, here at BambooHR, we work with financial advisors within our 401k plan. And we actually invite them to come into our offices once a month and invite our new hires to sign up for a slot to go and meet with them For the most part, they just need to see a name and a face and get to know the human being behind it, because 401k can be often very intimidating to employees. So these are all ideas talking about the reality that engagement is an ongoing process. Whether your employees are completing that first week or even their 5th year in your organization, it's important to promote and clarify your culture. And in practice, this means that you need to both identify where employees need support to align with your culture, and what are areas that your culture strategy can improve to match the needs of the individual employees. And getting this alignment down is really the key to building that bottom-up engagement strategy. And both sides of the cultural alignment need to start with a common reference point, data from your organization.
Great, Cassie. That was an awesome overview of employee engagement. And now I'm going to try to spend a few minutes talking about some techniques for very practically improving employee engagement at your own organization. And before going into that, I just wanted to sort of recap some of these sort of core tenets that that Cassie highlighted that I'll be going more into. So the first thing that that was mentioned that is so important is that engagement starts before the employee even walks in the door for their very first interview. It's their very first interaction at the beginning of your relationship. So think of employee engagement as a relationship between the company and the employee, and that starts from the beginning of the hiring process. It continues through with the way that the forms feel, the first days, the first 90 days of work. It starts early. So just like with products and customers, you would say that the seeds of success are sown very early. This is so true with employees. So making sure that you start engagement from the very get-go and the start with your hiring process is critical. The second point here, the second sort of theme, was that you should value every employee and listen to their stories, listen to their goals. Bottoms-up employee engagement is all about listening. It's all about starting from the employee and making sure that those sort of trees of growth are fully aligned. Incentives are powerful. They function both at the level of the employee and at the organization. And the very most powerful thing you can do is to make sure that those incentives are as closely aligned as possible. Naturally, over the months and the years, alignment will sort of start to diverge, and it will take the work of great management and great values to pull that together. And it's not like you solve alignment and it's there. It's an ongoing work. It's an ongoing process like any relationship. But making sure that you're listening to employees, listening to what they care about, and trying to align that with the company is critical. And then the last point, and this is what we'll talk about in a minute here, is that managers are the ones at the front lines of employee engagement. So HR teams should think through their leadership teams and their management teams. They should operate through those vessels. And so you need to obviously establish values, establish common practices, trainings. But the managers are the ones who are motivating individual employees, who are checking in on how people feel, who are taking the steps to make sure that the work is appropriate and that the alignment is there. So those principles of engage early and often, start from the employee and listen to them, and putting managers as sort of your philosophical front line, those are the keys. So now let's get into some practical elements here. So listening is the beginning. And so the very first thing that you need to do is to listen to your employees. One great way to do that is through collecting engagement data, and the simplest way to do that is through surveys. And so what kind of surveys? Well, there's a lot of different options for surveys. So a common type will be employee engagement surveys, and this is one way that you can listen to a variety of factors around employee engagement. So examples of this might be, do you feel that your own goals are tied in with the company's mission and goals? Do you feel that you even understand the company's missions and goals? Do you feel that you have a supportive manager? Do you feel that your manager's engaged? All these sorts of questions. And you can go deeper and deeper on all of these different points. And the nice thing about these types of surveys is you can do them in a way that make employees feel comfortable sharing what they need to so that the company can make decisions. So you can choose to do surveys like this anonymously or with various privacy restrictions. Sometimes You won't be able to pull all this information out in one-on-ones, and people are more comfortable writing it. But surveys are a very proven tool, and they're a way for you to listen to your employees. And that's the first step, obviously, before you can take action, is to figure out how people are actually feeling. Another great example of a survey type is eNPS. The E is employee, and the NPS, of course, is Net Promoter Score, like we do with our products. The concept here is the question, how likely are you to refer working at your organization to a friend? And so the kind of thinking there is, to what degree do our employees like their jobs enough that they would want the same thing for their friends? And so this is another type of survey, just like an employee engagement survey. It's not an end-all, be-all of listening, just like in a personal relationship, there's no one question that you can ask. But it will help you gather more data as you think about the sort of state of your employees and how they're feeling.
That's a good point, Jack. eNPS is not the one-size-fits-all tool. Let's be really clear about what it is. It's a very high-level tool, and it's going to illustrate high-level systemic problems in departments or for maybe your entire organization. And then after you've looked at those sections of your organization that need help, you're then going to need some more detailed tools to respond to the individual issues that you're going to see, maybe smaller sub-issues in a department or even for individual employees. So if eNPS is a tool used for the forest, you want to make sure that you have more specialized tools to address the trees.
Awesome. Thanks, Cassie. And so you collect data either through employee engagement surveys, through eNPS surveys, through various different sort of avenues. And now what? We've done the first part. We've listened. And now what are sort of the vehicles with which we can kind of follow up? Because as we all know, there's nothing more frustrating than listening and not hearing. And so if you're an employee and your company says, tell us how you feel, and then does nothing about it, you're not going to be very likely to tell them how you feel the next time they ask. And so it's really critical that you have feedback loops in place so that you and your managers and the leadership team at your company respond to all of this. And so the other point before jumping into a couple tactics is that you don't have to address everything. It is totally okay to say, we heard this, we're not going to focus on it right now because X, Y, and Z. That is still acknowledgement. That will still keep employees engaged if you have good explanations for it. So listening to employees is not an obligation to do every single thing that was requested, but you do want to address the big stuff, even if it's just to say, this quarter we're going to focus on these other things and here's why. People will really respect that. So in terms of tools that you have, the most important one, the most important ongoing management tool is one-on-ones. This is something that people should not put off. They shouldn't reschedule these if they can help it. They certainly shouldn't ignore them. Even though you commonly will see managers either not taking them seriously or in many cases not doing them at all, one-on-ones are a critical vehicle for employees to feel heard, to have a venue where they can talk about their needs, their goals. Generally, these should be done weekly. There are cases where doing them biweekly is appropriate. But the idea is that this is the employee's meeting. This is a chance for the employee and their manager to, I often say going for a walk, get out of the office is great, but have a chance to talk about all of this stuff. And so as the HR team, one of the sort of lowest hanging fruits, if this isn't happening already, is to take a look and make sure that your managers are doing one-on-ones on a weekly basis. Then you can talk to those managers about how to optimize those. And so it'll give you sort of a lever on your organization by which you can sort of, to a certain degree, standardize, but mainly to improve these meetings. So making sure that the conversations are focused on the right things. I remember for me when I was at Teespring, my last company, for a long time my manager was the CEO. And then we hired a chief revenue officer who became my manager sort of near the end of my tenure. And at our first one-on-one, he asked me a question that caught me totally off guard. He said, what do you care about? And I started rattling off the things that I care the most about. I was talking about there was a hire I needed to make, and there was, a deal that I needed to get signed, and there was an employee issue I had to work out. And he was like, oh, that's not what I mean. I mean, what do you, Jack, personally care about? And then he proceeded to ask me, questions for 45 minutes about, where did I grow up? What was important to me? What did I value? So what was I hoping to get out of my work at Teespring? What did I hope to get out of my career in general? And he just spent the time getting to know me. And so, he said to me that one-on-one was not our time to tick through agenda items. That was a time for him and me to discuss our relationship and to discuss, my relationship with the company. And that made me feel so different about, how listened to I was. It made me realize I had an advocate at the company. And so the power of those one-on-ones is sort of a direct line to employee engagement. And so that is the place to start. The next obvious sort of vehicle that you can use is reviews. And so these can either be performance reviews, they can be 360 feedback reviews. The idea is that you're reflecting on individual performances and getting some formal feedback from peers and managers. Generally, people will do this on a biannual cadence, sometimes as often as quarterly. Certainly here at Lattice, we believe that the old way of doing them once a year is not quite enough. But the nice thing about doing performance reviews as opposed to just giving feedback whenever is twofold. Number one, it makes it so that even managers who aren't naturally inclined to give feedback all the time will give feedback to their teams. And so you might have some managers who just by nature are giving feedback all the time, and their employees will certainly feel the benefits of that. And then you'll have others who don't do it naturally. They may be great managers in other ways, but that might not be their strong suit. And so one of the big benefits of doing reviews is that it will ask everybody to take time to make sure that everyone's getting feedback and no one slips through the cracks. The other big benefit of this type of feedback is that rather than ad hoc feedback or the sort of type of interactions that you might get in a one-on-one, this is quiet, reflective feedback where you sort of take your time, you think back over the period of several months, and you digest in a quiet space. And sometimes that type of feedback is unique. Sometimes it's valuable feedback that you wouldn't get in sort of the heat of the moment of the day or a particular project. And so for these reasons, reviews are a great time to talk about performance, to make sure that employees know how things are going. And there are all sorts of statistics from Gallup and others showing that one of the main drivers of employee engagement is actually receiving critical feedback. And so this runs a little counterintuitive to what a lot of people think, which is that people would want sort of just pats on the back and recognition, and they do want that. But people recognize that in order to get better, they need critical feedback. People have lived their lives, and they know that the way to get there is to sort of suffer some of the pain of hearing uncomfortable things and how you get better. And the data bears this out. And so you want to make sure that you have an opportunity for people in the context of a trusting environment to give each other critical feedback as well. And so those are some of the tools that you can use. But the real key with the survey data from the sort of the listening that you do at the beginning is transparency. So part of listening is mentioning to the other side that you hear them. And so when someone shares information with you in a personal context, a great technique is to state it back to them, to tell them that you've heard them. And the same is true with this sort of employee-employer relationship. So you can let them know the issues that you heard, explain whether you're going to address them or not, and if you are, how you're going to solve them. And these are sort of the loop closing. This loop closing is very critical to making sure that employees trust you, that you're going to follow up with them, that they should answer your questions the next time around. And that is going to be a great way to kind of continue this process and give you the ability to listen to employees so that you can even drive more engagement.
I love those comments, Jack, about surveys and engagement and how do we listen and hear, and also how important it is to make sure that we demonstrate with action and not just words that we have heard the things that employees are sharing with us. There's a second half to that equation, and it's accountability. And we talked earlier about making sure that we've empowered our employees, and we also need to do that with accountability in mind. So we need to set up an understanding of the limits of authority. It's really important. As you're offering your employees choices, you need to make sure that the choices are appropriate, the choices are healthy, and the choices are safe. I like to think of this from a parenting perspective. So I'm a proud mama bear. I've got two amazing children who are grown and gone, and I miss them and love the chances I get to see them. But as a parent, you would never give your child two bad options. You can either play with this knife or play on the freeway. None of those are okay for me. None of those are okay for them. And sometimes we forget to set up great choices for our employees through appropriate boundaries, by establishing clarity around authority, and making sure that when they're accountable, they get to come to me with great outcomes, not just bad outcome versus bad outcome. And when you look at these three conditions, right, appropriate, healthy, safe, it also means that you're not leaving the legal requirements to a majority rule perspective. Again, you as the business are in charge of ensuring that the outcomes are win-wins, that it's positive, that it's in compliance with laws and regulations. So make sure that you've got those boundaries set and you're doing that specifically. I also want to emphasize that it's not about implementing everybody's feedback. So Jack mentioned this, and I really liked the way he looks at it. I can't tell you how great it is. Instead of saying, no, we're not doing that, tell them what you are doing and the why. And when you spend time developing that strong and compelling why behind what you are focused on, then they're really willing to jump on board with that rather than just feel neglected or unheard or maybe even unappreciated, where you start to grow disengagement rather than engagement. And it also doesn't mean that you have to just accept what everybody says. I think part of having healthy engagement in your company is teaching good communication skills. So here at BambooHR, we really like to teach on some of the skills taught in the book Crucial Conversations. We like some of the approaches taught in the book Radical Candor, but we have company-wide communications. We have team-based trainings, really helping people get familiar with vocabulary that we use together, but also teaching skills so that when we're having these conversations, we're really going to end up moving forward and coming from places of differences to finding places of commonality. And one of the things that we really try to do is focus on letting our values be that unifying force. The framework of values is really, it helps to keep us on course towards our goal. And so as your organization grows and gets larger, sometimes it's hard for everybody to get that top-level access, right? I remember as employee 21 here at BambooHR almost 6 years ago, I literally shared a big, long folding table with two other employees. I sat right next to the COO, Ryan Sanders, one of our company founders, and my good friend Jeremy in our IT department. And so we worked together all day long, and now I have to hunt them down in the building somewhere in order to see them. So how are you doing that? How are you creating connections when you don't necessarily have that ease of access any longer? And that's where we really rely on having strong values, because it's less about who is right and more about what is right. What's the right thing to do? Hence, one of our company values, do the right thing. Let me give a more concrete business example. So here at BambooHR, we decided that we wanted to allow employees to participate in redesigning our very bland break rooms. We knew they were bland. We moved into the building, they were bland, and we wanted to get comfortable before we just threw in some design. So we wanted to open it up, but how do you do it and not just hurt everybody's feelings because you didn't pick their idea? And so we set parameters and constraints around that, and we made it clear that there would only be one winner, but we also made it clear that we would not specifically copy exactly everything in their winning design, but that we would really take the best ideas of their design and seek to implement them in a wise way that would have a wise budget, but also really create the overall atmosphere that we were looking to do. And the project went really, really smooth because we had been really clear up front and provided kind of feedback tools for helping them know how this break room would influence our culture, and we wanted it to create healthy patterns for employees in the workplace. So that went really well, but only because we took the time to be clear and define that up front. I have to brag, it was one of my team members that won, so yay.
That's awesome. Thank you, Cassie. And I think the last piece of this that we wanted to touch on is the importance of building a feedback culture and how much this can help with everything else that we've talked about. So getting your employees to a point where it feels like second nature to share feedback with each other is going to sort of smooth out every other process that you think about in terms of employee engagement. It'll make the surveys more direct. It'll make one-on-ones more successful. It'll make employee recognition better. It'll make 360 feedback more useful. The thing is, employees often know what needs to change. So they often know the improvements that their coworkers need to make, their employees, their manager. It's not that they don't have ideas. More often, the blocker is that it's difficult for people to express feedback. And so getting people to a place where they're able to share those views and they're comfortable explaining either this is something this person did great or this is something that needs work, getting people to be comfortable with that is really helpful. And whether it's books that Cassie mentioned, like Critical Conversations or Radical Candor, whether it's exemplifying the way that you want people to give feedback from the leadership team on down, or whether it's just talking about it a lot. Building a feedback culture is going to make it so that everything else that you do around employee engagement is much more productive. A common way that people will do this is to start with the easier stuff. So for example, you can start with a vehicle for praise. And so this is an example of what we do here at Lattice, which is the integration between our product and Slack so that people can share public praise between employees and others can sort of jump in and react with emojis or just comment on it, things like that. That's an easy way to get the habit rolling. And then you can start to also encourage critical feedback and constructive help. One of the most important ways that you can do that is to remind people that when people give not just positive feedback, but also constructive feedback, it's beneficial not just to the company, but also to the employee. People grow when they hear ways that they can improve, and it turns out that people really want that. And these don't have to be deeply personal. These don't have to be difficult all the time. It can be things as simple as, hey, I think you'd be more successful in that meeting if you asked everybody for their opinion before you stated your own. Or when you share out these marketing materials, I think it would be good if you checked with our designer before as part of the process. And so there's all these small things that people are even uncomfortable to share just at the risk of offending or anything like that blocks people. But you can teach an organization to do better at feedback. There's all sorts of different ways, and we can certainly talk about this in the Q&A if we want to. But one really simple example is to encourage people to say thanks when they get critical feedback. One of the best things that you can do with any of these processes is to create a feedback loop that makes people want to do it more. So just like with our engagement surveys, where we want to then be transparent about the results and explain to people what we are going to do, and that will encourage people to keep giving feedback in the future. When you give critical feedback to a peer, a manager, or a direct report, you'll often have anxiety that they're going to get upset, that you're going to feel bad. And so if the recipient of that feedback can sort of change that dynamic and say, thank you so much for letting me know that, whether you agree with the feedback or not, it's a helpful way to ensure that you're getting more feedback. So this is one type of tool that you can use. There's many others, but focusing on building a kind of a feedback-driven culture is important. And making feedback a habit will make sure that you don't have to continually work on it. It will become sort of a self-sustaining process at some point. So employees whose managers hold regular meetings with them are 3 times as likely to be engaged as employees whose managers don't. And so getting feedback, having these conversations all the time is not just going to improve performance, which it certainly will, but it's also going to improve engagement directly. Speaking of radical candor, one of the great things that Kim Scott said, we did an interview with her on our Lattice Resources for Humans series. She said, we owe it to each other to point out when we're screwing up. It's the only way to get better. And I really loved that quote because it changed the dynamic from a thing that you can do to almost an obligation. That at work, it's almost an obligation for people to share direct feedback with the people around them. And if you care about them, you'll share feedback with them. And I love that framing because so many of us do really care about the people that we work with, and we want to see them succeed and do better. And remembering that the way to help them is not just to give them praise and recognition, but to let them know where they can improve. That framing is going to be so helpful to your company.
Wow, Jack, I love that topic. Recently at BambooHR, we actually had a company-wide focus on feedback and making sure that it was healthy. But we realized that it's not always true. And rather than just focus on the giver being better at giving feedback, we took the opposite approach. And I'm going to share in the chat right now a link to a YouTube video that we shared with all of our teams. Sheila Heen talks about receiving feedback and how we internalize it. So we had an internal exercise where you kind of had this little spectrum and you plotted out, here's how I internalize feedback from maybe a spouse or a boss or a coworker, and we also plotted out different topics, the feedback that I get on my spreadsheets, right? I'm super sensitive to that, or whatever it was, and really helped people look at the spectrum and decide what they could do to make feedback a more positive thing in their life. So we'll put that out there in the chat. Hopefully that'll be helpful to you. So let's step back and look at the key takeaways from today. It's really important that you make sure that you include a bottom-up perspective in employee engagement. And not just include it, but I think you will have better results when you view both the top-down and bottom-up pieces through the bottom-up lens. It needs to resonate with employees and be on their level. Number two, make sure that you're measuring engagement and that you've got a starting point and you have a strategy to help drive that information. Number three, focus on that alignment between the employee and the organization, but make sure you're doing it through that full life cycle. So prior to hiring, what's going on in your employer branding, what's going on in the candidate experience, and of course what's going on in your one-on-ones and performance management tools inside your company. Number four, transparency and accountability. When you partner those together, you're really going to infuse feedback as a positive tool in your company rather than a negative one. And then lastly, you want to make sure that you have consistency in what you're doing. These are never going to be quick and easy wins. You're going to see positive surges and jumps, but it's about the long-term journey if you want to develop these skills and experiences inside your organization long-term. Okay, we have finished sharing our information with you about building more effective and better results-driven employee engagement strategies in your company. Before we jump into Q&A, I just wanted to share an offer that BambooHR has. We'd love for you to try out our software. You can receive a free job posting on our ATS and a full HRIS for 1 week. And then, Jack, would you like to introduce Lattice's offering?
Absolutely, yeah. So if you want to sign up with Lattice for our performance management and feedback and goal setting platform, you'll receive 3 free months on our platform with an annual agreement. There's also, of course, a partnership with Bamboo, and we have a free integration that we can do to sync up with BambooHR.
Great. And just a reminder, you do get SHRM credits for attending this webinar as long as you were in the webinar for at least 50 minutes. That's automatically going to come to your email. You should get it in the next 2 days, so please be watching for that. Again, we will also send out a recording of the webinar so you can go back in detail and review the things you were excited about. let's jump into some questions. So Jack, I'm going to throw the first one at you. Here's the question. Sometimes formal reviews can feel punitive or disciplinary and not necessarily achieving the aim of curbing the unwanted behaviors or promoting desired ones. Also, rater biases and halo effects can creep in. Can you address alternatives or whether you advocate for continued use of formal performance appraisals?
That's a great question. So how do you make sure that performance reviews are not happening in a way that make employees feel worse? There's two sort of high-level pieces of advice I have here. The first is you don't need every single review that you do to be formal. So what a lot of companies will do is, as an example, they might do one kind of formal performance review each year that affects compensation and leveling and job titles and things like that. And then maybe one or two or even three other times throughout the year, they'll do feedback that is very explicitly directed at employee development. So maybe in December, they'll do sort of an evaluation-based review, and then maybe in each other quarter of the year, say April, July, and maybe October, they'll do feedback that is purely for the employee's benefit. A lot of companies will also do this biannually. The advantage of separating out developmental-based feedback from evaluation-based feedback is to pull that tension out. And so to make it so that people have a space to give critical feedback that is purely for the employee's benefit without any anxiety about it impacting that employee feeling punitive, but still having a space to give them that type of feedback. So separating those two out is one of the keys. The other is to sort of change the narrative there as much as possible from critical feedback being punitive or even performance evaluations, even figuring out ways to make those feel constructive and like an opportunity for employees to share where they've been successful and what's been going well and have a clear vehicle for them to progress their careers. Even with those reviews, it is possible to sort of change that narrative. And of course, there will be instances where there's still anxiety, compensation and jobs are always a tricky component, but you can do two things. One is separate out those two types of reviews, and the other is to change the narrative there to make it more of an opportunity.
That's great, Jack. The other thing I would recommend is just how we discussed that an ENPS tool is very high level and a one-on-one is a more refined tool. Think about performance management from that view. What is your 10,000-foot level tool? Maybe it's an annual performance encounter or meeting. And then what are your more day-to-day? So I would look at kind of a striated approach to making sure you have a comprehensive tool set around performance management and looking at that. Okay, next question. How do you recommend instilling employee engagement for a geographically dispersed workforce? Ooh, that's always a hard one. I think it's just about where can you create people connecting opportunities in your company. So at BambooHR, I'd say we have about 30% of our team members work remote. And so we have a cameras on policy, meaning when you're in a meeting, you have a camera on so that you're engaging. Instead of just sending an email, you jump in the video chat and you're interacting. What about how do you share what's going on with other coworkers, whether it's through workflow or other things like that? What are the channels that you might use to help create transparency and engagement there? And then I always like to have that common purpose and goal that you know that you're working on together and you see how that other person's interactions are influencing it. So how are you sharing those success stories, customer feedback, other things like that to help promote it? Jack, any ideas you've got?
Yeah, I think some of those are great examples. Some other things that you can do are make sure that, for example, your meetings are held at times that are convenient for everybody to join. So if you have an all-hands, do your best not to alienate people in different time zones or things like that. If you do have sort of platforms where everybody can be in a sort of a group chat or group recognition, make sure that those are live and active so people who are not in online at all the exact same hours or in the same office can still have a community they can feel part of. So whatever you can do to explicitly include those people who aren't in the office every single day, I think is going to go a long way.
Okay, we have a lot of questions and they're great, but unfortunately we've run out of time. So I want to thank you again for joining us this afternoon to help look at the important issue of employee engagement. Thank you for following us and continue to follow us online, and I love those LinkedIn connections. So have a great day and good luck with the ambitious goals in your organization. Thanks, everyone.